I put out a little movie, less than a half a minute or so online, asking people what they would do if they could share their gifts around all year long instead of one time a year. Because oftentimes we think about giving gifts during the end of our calendar year, during the holidays and Christmas time. But I wonder what would happen if you and I decided to share our gifts 12 months out of the year. Thomas Kempis wrote a long time ago, "A wise lover values not so much the gift of the lover as the love of the giver." As the love of the giver. I've told you a number of times that what my wife and I try to do is try to lift the pressure off the other one. And I do it in certain ways, and she does it in certain ways, and it's really cool how we go over and above to make sure, at least try to make sure, that that load is at least a little lighter on the other person in the household. Over in Isaiah chapter 29, let me set the scene just a little bit here for Isaiah. In the Old Testament of Scripture, for a lot of years, there were people called prophets. And these prophets would try in their way to get a group of people that called themselves followers of God to do the things, the good deeds that God has instructed them for a number of years. So they used a multitude of prophets because many of these God followers, with a capital G, God followers, tended to, over a period of time, fall into the habits of the people in their area. That is, in some of those cultures, they would manufacture and build small g gods and find themselves, the religious people, the Jewish people of that time, would then worship these man-made idols instead of doing the things that the Talmud taught them to do. So over in Isaiah chapter 29, Isaiah, this prophet, likened Jerusalem, or the people actually in that area, to be blind and drunk. Let's kind of share this text in Isaiah number 29, starting at about verse 13. And one text says, "Then the Lord said, because this people draw near with their words and honor me with their service, but they remove their hearts far from me, and their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote." Now, I'll get to a paraphrase of that to make it a little easier to understand. But verse 14 says, "Therefore, behold, I will once again deal marvelously with these people, wonderfully marvelous. And the wisdom of their wise men will perish, and the discernment of their discerning men will be concealed." Verse 15, woe to those who deeply hide their plans from the Lord. You can't hide from God no matter what you try to do. I mean, I've tried it, you've tried it, we just can't do it. And those deeds are done in a dark place, and they say, who sees us or who knows us? You turn things around. Shall the potter be considered as equal as the clay? That what is made would say to this maker, how did you not make me? Or what is formed to him who formed him? He says, have you no understanding? And let me kind of break this down into a simple paraphrase, because I'm just a simple guy. I'm not a very deep guy, so to speak. But a paraphrase of this in the Living Bible says this, or at least a piece of it in verse 13. "And so the Lord says, since these people say they are mine, but they do not obey me, and since their worship amounts to mere words learned by rote, therefore I will take awesome vengeance on these hypocrites," this paraphrase says, and make their wisest counsels as fools. Verse 15. He says, woe to those who try to hide their plans from God, who try to keep him in the dark concerning what they do. Folks will say in this text, God can't see us. They say to themselves, he doesn't know what is going on. How stupid this can be. How can the potter say that he's greater than you, the jars he makes? The whole point here is that these people in this culture thought that they were all that. But God said that there's going to come a time when I'm going to show you who really is all that. And you're not in that group who thinks they're all that. I was putting this together some weeks ago, And I came up with this quote that you might want to write down at some point. It says, when you and I get confused or so arrogant to understand that we should be servants to other people, we miss out on the best life has in store for us. Let me repeat it again. When you and I get confused or so arrogant to really not understand that we should be servants to other people, we miss out on the best life has in store for us. Isaiah was, in essence, telling the people of that time and that culture that you're not all that. God is all that. God can do things that, frankly, you and I can't do. There's an interesting story of an old village in Spain. The people of this village heard the king planned to visit there. No king had ever done that. So naturally, they became excited and wanted to offer a great celebration that would show their adoration and that would honor the king. But what could a village of such poor people offer? Good question. Someone proposed that since so many of the villagers made their own wines, actually very good wines, they could offer that to please the king. And they each decided that they would all take some of their best wine and combine them as a gift for the king. On the day of the king's arrival, they all came to the village square early in the morning with a large cup of their finest wine and poured their offering into a small opening at the top of a large barrel. They were excited to see the king enjoy the best wine he'd ever tasted. When he arrived, the king was escorted to square, and he was ceremoniously presented with a silver cup and invited to draw wine from the barrel. He was told that the villagers were delighted to have him taste the best they had to offer. He filled his cup from the spigot, and when he drank the wine, to his surprise, he tasted only water. Had some miracle worker turned wine to water? Had someone stolen all the wine that was meant for the king? No, you see. Each villager had reasoned, I'll withhold my best wine and give water. There will be so many cups of excellent wine poured into the barrel that mine will never be missed. After all was said and done, the king was left with a town full of people who simply went through the motions of showing their love and their adoration for him. So this is what the nation of Israel was guilty of, where Isaiah said in verse 13, these people come to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. How many times haven't you seen people that said certain things, but their actions are something totally different? This is the story of this wine story that, sometimes we say a bunch of stuff, but really when it comes down to it, we're not all that. Gary Inrig writes, several years ago, 2 students graduated from a school out west. The highest ranking student in the class was blind, named Overton. And when he had received his honor, he insisted that half the credit should go to his friend. They had met one another in school, and when the armless friend had guided the blind Mr. Overton down a flight of stairs, the acquaintance ripened into friendship, and a beautiful example of interdependence happened. Interdependence. The blind man carried the books which the armless man read aloud in their common study, and thus, the story says, the individual deficiency of each, listen, was compensated for by the other. After their graduation, they planned to practice law together because they complemented each other. Oftentimes, you and I hoard our gifts so much. We want to keep them to ourselves instead of sharing them with a world that very candidly needs them a lot more than we do. And sometimes we think that the value of our gifts aren't very valuable to other people, when in fact some people are really starving for those gifts that we have, that we've been sitting on, that we've been hoarding, that we've been afraid to share because we didn't value them like other people may value them. The great violinist, I'll probably pronounce his name wrong, Paganini, I hope I said it correctly, if not, much apologies, willed his marvelous violin to Genoa, the city of his birth, but only on one condition, that the instrument never be played upon. Never be played upon. It was an unfortunate condition, for it is particularly of the wood, that as long as it's used and handled, it shows little wear. And as soon as it's discarded, listen, as soon as this wood is discarded, it begins to decay. It begins to decay. So the exquisite mellow-toned violin has become worm-eaten in its beautiful case, valueless except as a relic. The moldering instrument is a reminder that a life, listen, that a life withdrawn from all service to others loses its meaning. So oftentimes you and I choose to, I'll say it multiple times, sit on what we can do to bless other people. When we do that, we kind of rot from the inside out. Because I believe that we are born to give, we are born to share, we are born to make a difference. So then when we choose not to do that, then we kind of erode, and then oftentimes we tend to get ugly in the sense of our attitudes get sour, we start blaming other people, we start looking at other situations and then really becoming really depressed and really negative, when in fact, when you look at the lives of other people and how you can make a difference in their lives, then at least in my case, your problems don't seem as big, because then your focus is on other people's problems and trying to help them in a variety of different ways. Over in 2 Timothy chapter 1, let me just set the scene. St. Paul, who wasn't always a saint, and I shared that a bit last week, but Paul had a student, a younger gentleman by the name of Timothy. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, the New American Standard Version of this text says, again, 2 Timothy chapter 1, says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, according to the promises of life in Christ Jesus. This is his introduction to this note to these people. For me, I would say, hey, what's up? But this is how Paul decides to intro it. So he says, to Timothy, my beloved son, grace and mercy and peace from God the Father and Christ Jesus. He says, I thank God whom I serve with a clear conscience. Now stop and think about this a minute. This is Paul, who was Saul, who was an accomplice to murder, had the guts to say this in verse 3, I thank God whom I serve with a clear conscience. That's a whole new sermon. I'm not going to get distracted there. The way my forefathers did, as I constantly remember you in my prayers night and day, longing to see you, even as I recall your tears, so that I may be filled with joy. Verse 5, for I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, for I am sure that it is in you as well. Verse 6. Listen, this is the meat of this particular text I want to get to. For this reason, I remind you to, this text says, kindle afresh the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God has not given you a spirit of timidity, but of power and of love and discipline, this text says. Now, let's kind of back up a tiny bit and paraphrase this, thanks to a gentleman by the name of Eugene Peterson, starting in verse 5. That precious memory triggers another. Your honest faith, the paraphrase says, and what a rich faith it is, handed down from your grandmother Lois to your mother Eunice, and now to you. And the special gift of ministry you received when I laid hands on you and prayed, he says, keep that ablaze. Keep that ablaze. God doesn't want us to be, listen, God doesn't want us to be shy with his gifts, but bold and loving. Bold and loving and sensible. Bold and loving and sensible. Verse 6. This being so, I want you to stir into flame the strength and boldness. Again, I want to remind you to stir into flame the strength and boldness. I'll say it for the third time. I want to remind you to stir into flame the strength and boldness that is in you. That is in you. So it says that the gifts were placed on him because of the laying on of hands. He says the gifts are already in you, right? Again, for fourth time, verse 6. This being so I wanted to remind you to stir into flame, again, this is another paraphrase, to stir into flame the strength and boldness that's in you, that entered into you, again, let's skip down. And so the Holy Spirit, God's gift, listen, does not want you to be afraid of people, but be strong and wise, and to love them and enjoy being with them. So the actual text in my paraphrase, my translation, which is extremely loose, that it's our job to stay fired up, to leverage the gifts that you and I have in us. In fact, the actual Greek term of this little tiny piece says that I, Paul, am reminding you to be live, firing the grace effect. That term. That, in other words, that it's up to us to stir the pot. There's been so many times when Tammy will be trying to fix a meal and she's multitasking, doing a number of different things. And all she asked me to do is, or one of the kids to do, is just stir the pot. Just keep the pot stirring, because if you don't keep the pot stirring, then 9 times out of 10, the contents of the pot is going to stick, and then it's going to burn, it's going to have issues, it's going to taint the whole, it's going to smell bad, it's going to taste bad, the whole point. So my job is just to stir the pot. Or my kid's job is just to stir the pot. Well, I'll get distracted. I'll get, look at this happening on the phone. And a phone call come in, or somebody's doing this over there, or somebody's doing that over there. And it happens probably more than half the time that I'll get sidetracked and I'll forget to keep the pot stirring. And then eventually, occasionally at least, that the contents of the pot doesn't taste as good if I would have kept the pot stirred. If that illustration makes any sense. So it's really up to us to, by using our gifts, by sharing our gifts consistently, it enables the pot to be stirred more often. The story says Steve Garvey, and if you're old enough, you remember Steve Garvey when he was on the LA Dodgers. What position did he play? He played first base. Well, he eventually was traded to the San Diego Padres, and the story says that he was never cut from an athletic team in his schoolboy days. However, he was cut from the high school concert choir in his senior year. His teacher told him he lacked the range for the school's first concert program of the season. But Garvey was a determined young man. He practiced and practiced with a piano accompanist until he improved his voice quality. He later was part of the choir team that earned best in state in a Florida state championship. Why? Because he chose to say, well, I appreciate your opinion that I'm not good enough, but I'm going to get good enough. So many of us rely on and this is a whole new text too, that so many of us rely on the opinions of other people, and those opinions stop us in our tracks so fast. And it really truly is only an opinion of somebody else. It's their opinion. It doesn't make it a fact. It doesn't, it's not written in law anywhere. It's their opinion. So what people say that you're not good enough? That is their opinion. That is not necessarily the truth. A sports reporter once interviewed, this is a very interesting story. A sports reporter once interviewed a famous NFL quarterback about what it takes to win. What it takes to win. The quarterback had left college early to enter the NFL draft, and during his career, he was regarded as a tremendous passer, but not much of a scholar. So the reporter decided to ask him to react to some English prose. He began to read the following Jack London quotation, quote, "I would rather be ashes than dust. I would rather that my sparks should burn out in a brilliant blaze than it should be stifled by dry rot. I would rather be a superb meteor, every atom in me a magnificent glow, than a sleepy, permanent planet." This is all this conversation that went on between this guy and this NFL player. "The proper function of a man is to live, not to exist. I shall not waste my days in trying to prolong them. I shall use my time." So after all this, after reading this prose, this poem, these words of this great author, the reporter asked him, "What does that mean to you?" So now remember, this quarterback was not very deep academically. So he thought about it for a few minutes, and the quarterback just responded in just 2 simple words: throw deep. Just throw deep. Just keep it simple. Just keep it simple. Just keep it easy. How many times haven't we, when we start out in life, this happens to many, many children, they start out in life with all the energy in the world. You know, they're excited about walking, and they get up and walk, and eventually they're starting to run. And then once they hit school, they get around some young people who keep putting them down and keep putting them down. And then after a period of time, you see that those dreams and that energy and that passion of these children kind of leak out because of the opinions of other people. It's so important. And again, this is a third or fourth sermon, but it's so important to surround yourself with the right kind of people that won't squash out the flame, as Paul was telling Timothy. Don't allow other people, and he expands upon that after in other areas where he says, don't let people despise how young you are. It doesn't matter how young you are. Keep stirring the pot. Keep stirring that flame in you. So in 2 Timothy 2 verse 6, another paraphrase says, this being so, I wanted to remind you to stir into flame the strength and boldness that's in you. Have you ever been faced with situations in your life which an hour prior you were so relaxed and so easygoing, but something happened? Maybe it was an attack upon you or an attack on your child or a situation at work, but that fire jumped up in you like real quick. Happens to be. So the whole point is that we have it in us anyway. All we have to do is tap into it and plug it in and keep the pot stirring. Turn over to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, the Living Bible puts it in a way that I can understand better. Romans chapter 12, starting in verse number 1. It says this, Romans 12, starting in verse 1, it says, and so, dear brothers, I plead with you to, this text says, give your bodies to God. King James, I think, says to present your bodies a living sacrifice. That's what King James says, I believe. Let them be this paraphrase says, let them be a living sacrifice, holy, the kind God can accept. When you think of what he's done for you, is this too much to ask? Verse 2. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, again, but be a new and different person with a fresh newness in all you do and all you think. Let me share it again. But a new and different person with a fresh newness in all you do and think. Then you will learn from your own experience how his ways will really satisfy you. Sometimes it's really hard to look at something a different way. That's another text. Verse 3. As God's messengers, I give each of you God's warning. Listen to this. This is hard for some of us. Be honest in your estimate of yourselves. Be honest in your estimate of yourselves, measuring your value by how much faith God has given you. I didn't write down what other texts say, but oftentimes we underestimate our value, don't we? Depending on how we're wired. And others of us overestimate our value. This paraphrase says, to be honest in your estimate of yourselves, measuring your value by how much faith God has given you. Verse 4. Just as there are many parts of our body, so it is with Christ's body. We are all parts of it. And it takes every one of us to make it complete. For we each have different work to do, right? So we belong to each other, and each needs all the others. Yes or no? Isn't that true? Verse 6. God has given each of us the ability to do certain things well. I thought, this is going to sound so stupid, I thought as a boy that all men had to do all things well. So I grew up with this stress level, this tremendous stress level, that I had to be good at everything. Now that I'm approaching the half-century mark, guess what? I've wised up a little bit. And the wisdom I've come up with is I only need to be good at a few things and be happy with being okay at doing those few things well, because I can't do everything. And by the way, guess what? You can't do everything well. So if we get that pressure off our back, so we have to be good at everything. Maybe you didn't deal with that, or maybe I'm the only one here that had that problem. But I thought that I had to be a guy that I had to do all things well. You don't. You do a few things well and then marry the person that does the rest. That's what I did. But that's another sermon. Verse 6, again, God has given each of us the ability to do certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, then prophesy whatever you can, or as often as your faith is strong enough to receive a message from God. Listen to this. If your gift is to serve others, serve them well. Serve them well. If you're a teacher, this paraphrase says, do a good job teaching. If you're a preacher, see to it that your sermons are strong and helpful. If God has given you money, be generous in helping others with it. If God has given you administrative ability and put you in charge of the work of others, listen, this paraphrase says, take the responsibility seriously. This is Romans, okay? Those who offer comfort to the sorrowing should do it with Christian cheer. So again, it is stating all these different gifts and talents that we should do it, in my paraphrase, with excellence in all that we do. Verse 9, this gets some of us. Don't just pretend that you love others, really love them. Again, don't pretend to just love others, really love them. Hate what is wrong. Stand on the side of the good. Verse 10, love each other with brotherly affection and take delight in honoring each other. Never be lazy in your work, but serve the Lord enthusiastically. Let me back up one half sentence. Never be lazy in your work. This goes back to what we just read. I'm not going to read it again. But what we just read prior to that little phrase, that little 4 or 5 words, says that we should do all things very, very well. If we're wired to do this, if we're trained to do this, we shouldn't do it halfway. And then he says in verse 11, never be lazy in your work. So it's up to you and I, listen, it's up to you and I to be proactive in what we do, isn't it? So when we have to rely on other people to push us, then we're really not doing what this text just told us to do. There was a wise old botany teacher that was speaking to a group of young and eager students. He gave them an assignment to go out to the side of some lonely road and find a small, unnoticed flower. He asked them to study the flower for a long time. Get a magnifying glass and study the delicate veins in the leaves and notice the nuances and shades of color. Turn the leaf slowly and observe its symmetry. And remember, this flower might have gone unnoticed and unappreciated if you had not found and admired it, he told his students. So this great, unusual teacher, when the class returned after carrying out the assignment, the wise old teacher observed, people are just like that unnoticed flower. He said, each one is different, carefully crafted, uniquely endowed, but you have to spend time with a person to realize this. He ends with, so many people go unnoticed, again, so many people go unnoticed and unappreciated because no one has ever taken time with them and admired their uniqueness. That's from a little booklet called The Sower's Seeds. Let me read that last part. So many people go unnoticed and unappreciated because no one has ever taken the time with them and admired their uniqueness. And I would say there's been millions of those people through the centuries that have gone unnoticed and unhonored, right? Amen. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 6, the Amplified Bible says this. This is why I would remind you to stir up, or the Amplified would expand that. It says to rekindle the embers of, or fan the flames of, and keep burning the gracious gift of God, the inner fire that is in you by means of the laying on of hands with those of the elders at the ordination. We shared that, but it kind of expanded on that a bit, that it's up to us to keep it going. It's so easy to turn the burner off and leave the burner off for months and years and decades because we choose not to keep the pot going. We choose not to keep stirring the pot over and over again. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4 is a very interesting piece of Scripture. 1 Peter 4, reading from the New American Standard Bible, starting in about verse number 8. 1 Peter 4, New American Standard Bible, starting in verse number 8. It says this, it says, above all, fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Now let me just pause, time out on this one. This is Peter's letter. If you know the backstory of Peter, let me just share a 2-minute version of it. Peter was a follower of Christ. His career was in fishing. He followed Jesus for a time, and he thought that he was all that. I mean, he thought that he was it. Until the rubber met the road when Jesus was about to be taken away. Jesus was then taken away, and then he was presented in a situation where he was among a group of people, and they thought that he sounded like one of these followers of Jesus. Now, Jesus, before that, had predicted that before the morning comes, you're gonna tell everybody that you don't know me, not once, but 3 times. That's exactly what happened. But then after the fact, we find in more of the backstory that Jesus loved him anyway after the fact. Let's go back to 1 Peter. So again, Peter's talking from experience here, isn't he, in this text? 1 Peter 4. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Verse 9. Be hospitable to one another without complaint. That last 2 words is also another sermon. Verse 10. As each of you has received a special gift, listen, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. So this is, we just read Paul's advice that says, if you're given a certain amount of gifts or a certain talent, then do it for the benefit of other people. Now, Peter's saying the same thing, isn't he? Right? Again, as each of you has received a special gift, employ it in serving others, one another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Verse 11. Whoever speaks is to do so as one who is speaking the utterances of God. Whoever serves is to do so as one who is serving by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things, listen, God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Anyway, right? Now, the paraphrase of the same text, again, I love the paraphrases because they put it in terms that I think the average Joe and Susie get. Most of all, love each other as if your life depended on it. Love makes up for practically anything. Be quick to give a meal to the hungry, a bed to the homeless, cheerfully. That's not always the easy part, is it? Be generous with the different things be generous with the different things God gave you, passing them around so all get in on it. If words, let it be God's words. If help, let it be God's hearty help. That way, God's bright presence will be evident in everything through Jesus, and he'll get all the credit as one mighty in everything, encores to the end of time. So maybe this text, which I hope you're seeing through this text, is that what we're supposed to do with our gifts is to share our gifts in every way possible with as many people as possible. Because if we understood that the gifts that we have in us that funnel through us will be magnified as we share them and continue to stir the pot, we would be foolish to sit on them and not share them. The byproduct of your journey, listen, again, this is some deep stuff, but the byproduct of your journey and your choices could be the seeds to developing your gifts. Let me slow it down and share it 2 more times at least. Ready? The byproduct of your journey and your choices could be the seeds to developing your gifts. Let me say it again. The byproduct of your journey and your choices could be the seeds to developing your gifts. So when you and I choose to follow up on those hunches, or maybe not even hunch, maybe just as a desire to make a positive change in people's lives, that could be the seed to do something that you never even saw before you started taking the steps to make a difference in somebody's life in that small little one act of love. So unless you and I choose to take these consistent steps out of love, out of what all we just shared about what Paul said and what Pete said, then unless that happens, then we're not going to be able to really embrace and leverage the gifts and the talents that God has placed in our lives. Now, the struggles all of us have overcome. All of us have had struggles at a variety of places at different times in our lives. And the bruises, frankly, that are still healing and the tears that you've cried and the anger you felt, listen, could be leveraged to make a difference in other people's lives. Let me share that again. The struggles you've overcome, the bruises that are still healing, the tears you've cried, and the anger you felt, yes, the anger you felt, could be leveraged to make a difference in other people's lives. So what I'm asking you to do, to really stop and think for a minute here, is are you going to waste those tears? Are you going to waste that anger? Are you going to waste all those years of blood, sweat, and tears, if you will? Or if not, leverage those for the sake of other people that are around you every single day. Just about every person in ancient times have, and even these days, have risen to the top of whatever they're trying to do because they kept fanning the flames of the gifts that are in them. And oftentimes you and I, over a period of years, we have gotten frozen in our walk, in our journey, because we looked in the mirror and said, well, I can't possibly do that because I am this, or I've been through this, or I've stumbled here, I've made these mistakes. It doesn't really matter based on what I've just shared with you so far. Rick Warren said this. He said, the first thing you must do to understand your destiny is to recognize the gifts God has given you to use. He says this. They include the things you can't control. Your parents, your nationality, your race, your language. They also include how you're wired, your abilities, your personality. He says, now, you are not, he said, listen to this. He says, you are not responsible for the gifts God didn't give you. That took some pressure off me right away, right there. I love that. Again, you're not responsible for the gifts God didn't give you. In other words, if you're not artistically gifted, you are not expected to paint paintings like Rembrandt. But you are responsible for the ones he did give you. Now, doesn't that free us all up right here? Your stress level just should have dropped in half, right? I know it did me when I read it. When you get to heaven, God isn't going to compare you with someone else, but he will compare you with yourself. What did you do with what you were given, Rick Warren asks, that God may say? What could you have done if you had trusted God a little bit more? Romans 14 says, each of us will be given an account of ourselves to God. He ends with, God has given you gifts for a purpose, and you have a responsibility to be a good steward of those gifts. Not for selfish uses, he says, but for the good of others. Your gifts are not for your benefit. God gave you gifts for the benefit of other people. Ask yourself, he ends with, what has God given me for good use for other people? Now just take a minute and do a quick 30-second little inventory of your own gifts. Saying, how can I leverage those gifts for the benefit of other people? I should have brought the theme music for Jeopardy. Dun, 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 dun. But just take a minute. Think about it. Turn up. That's enough. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 8. The Living Bible puts it, again, in a little different way. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Now, the Old Testament is full of, some really, my terminology, messed up stuff. I mean, some wild stuff went on in the Old Testament. I'm not going to get into the meat and potatoes of all that, but that's some pretty heavy-duty stuff that went on there. But Deuteronomy 8 says this, in verse 1, you must obey all the commandments I give you today. If you do, you will not only live, you will multiply and go in and take over the land God promised to your fathers by God. Now, this these words are shared to the people that were freed from Egyptian slavery, and they were told that if you do this, you will get that. But if you don't do this, then you're not going to get that. Verse number 2. Do you remember how the Lord led you through the wilderness for all those 40 years, humbling you and testing you to find out how you would respond and whether or not you would really obey him? Yes, he humbled you by letting you go hungry and then feeding you with manna, a food previously unknown to both of you and your ancestors. How did it to help you realize that food isn't everything, and that really comes by obeying every commandment of God? For all these 40 years, you clothe yourselves and haven't grown old, and your feet haven't been blistered or swollen. So you should realize that as a man punishes his son, the Lord punishes you to help you. I'll just pause here in verse 6. Obey the laws of the Lord your God. Skip down to verse 11. But that is the time to be careful. Be aware or beware that in your plenty you don't forget God and begin to disobey him. For when you have become full and prosperous, listen, when you have become full and prosperous and say these things, that I have built these fine homes, and when your flocks and herds have become very large and your silver multiplied, that's when you should be careful that you don't forget where God has taken you. And he goes on to repeat that again over and over again. Kevin Miller shares a story. He says, once upon a time there was a famous, and I'll end here with this story. Once upon a time there was a famous house builder and painter. After designing the homes, he would then build and paint them. As a painter, he was such an amazing artist that he didn't even need drop cloths. That's one amazing painter, right? He had a steady hand, and he was finicky about using good brushes and quality paint. So there were no drips, just tight trim lines. This craftsman always designed and built and painted the homes all by himself, with his own hands. But then one day, he had a remarkable idea. As he was standing by one of his houses, he saw a bunch of kids walking home from the local elementary school. They were minding their own business, laughing and carrying their backpacks, until he shouted, "Hey kids!" When they looked up, startled and awestruck, because everyone in town knew about his amazing skills. He asked them a surprising question. How would you like to do some painting? Think about this a minute. This is a man with tremendous expertise. Didn't need drop cloths, had a steady hand and all that. What do you mean? I'll tell you what, he said. I'll give each of you a bucket of paint and a brush. And you can paint my new house. Do you want to give it a try? For real? They squealed with delight. The painter nodded and he says, yup. For real. Cool, the kids said. He opened up the back of his truck and pulled out a load of brushes and paint cans and then pried open the paint cans. They started splashing paint on his garage door. They got paint on the sidewalk too, and some on each other. But they also got a lot of paint on the house, all different colors, especially on the parts of the house that were under 4 feet high. As other kids came by on the sidewalk, they asked, "Can we do that too?" And they joined in. In about an hour, most of the first floor was now covered with paint. The house painter's neighbors came over and after dinner and took it all in. "What's going on?" they asked. Another blurted out, "Look, I got to be honest, your house looks like a tornado ripped through it, through Sherwin-Williams. What were you thinking?" Well, the house painter said, "Of course I could have painted this house all by myself, but I've always built and painted houses in order to bring joy to others. So based on that goal, this is the most beautiful house I've ever made." He said, "Then dozens of their friends who will want to come to this house, they'll bring their friends to show what they've painted. And each one will say, 'This is the home of the master painter and builder, but it's also our house.'" In the same way, the storyteller says, when God, the master creator and painter of the world, hands every single one of us a can of paint and a brush, he says, "Go to work. Use your gifts and let's paint a beautiful house for the world." I thought that was a very apropos little story to end the text, which I called, "What do you do with your gifts?" So I end where I began with the first quote I shared. A wise lover values not so much the gift of the lover as the love of the giver. So I suggest to you and I and all of us that we should find ways to leverage your gifts and talents for the benefit of other people. Because I found in my own life that when I've done that, I've felt more complete and more full and more engaged and have more joy in my life because of how much I give and how much I share. So if we could all maybe adopt the words of Paul and Peter and others here today, to do that consistently, to leverage our gifts for the benefit of other people, all of us are going to live lives that are so much more full than we've ever thought possible.